Luniel and Max, welcome to the Leanpub launch video for Ready, Why Most Software Projects Fail and How to Fix It. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about yourselves and about your book and what it's about and who it's for. So, Luniel, why don't you start by talking about yourself and your background, where you're from, and your career?
Sure. My early background started coding back in the 80s. Did that for quite some time until like real coding software solutions until late 90s before I moved to the States from South Africa. And here I've been ever since, and I've been involved in software development in one way, shape, or form my entire career. And I moved into more on the product management side as well as process side in the early to mid 2000s. Cut my teeth on Scrum in 2007. And anyway, and so as a result of that work that I've done and my early actual experience developing software for specific customers and stakeholders, almost always single-handedly, not like what we have now with massive teams of people working on software. I guess I cut my teeth there on working with stakeholders and trying to understand their problems, and then understanding that it takes a while to actually get clear understanding of the problems, but also of what the solutions might need to be, and working through that anyway. So I've had a background in consulting as well for quite some time, specifically around things like agile processes and agile transformation. I've worked in very large companies, Microsoft, Nordstrom, involved in actual software development efforts that would be about 2,000 engineers in it, 12 to 24 teams around that, either focusing on product management, on process management, agile transformation, etc. And then with just so many different companies as clients over the years. And so I'd seen the struggles that teams have had in software development that seems to be holding them back and leading to problems. And so for me, I guess part of my way of seeing the world is I'm really a more of a operations type of thinking, a systems thinker, I guess. I didn't really understand that at the time, but for me, I always like to understand the big picture. I want to understand what's the end-to-end process. I want to understand how things are connected. I want to understand certain parts of that and how they all build up to a whole. And then I look at the problems and I want to try to do root cause analysis. And over the years, I've learned that much of the stuff out there is dealing with symptoms instead of truly stepping back, but also having a very high level, but also comprehensive, broad but comprehensive view of how things work and how they're interrelated. And so my drive towards root cause analysis has allowed me to also bring in my experience from various different disciplines and different efforts, and to be able to kind of see these connections. And so Ready as a book is the culmination of a lot of that understanding of identifying some of these key contributors to why software projects tend to fail in companies. So anyway, so that's
Yeah.
that's my background.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that story. And Max, what about you?
I'm a second generation software developer. Started developing when I was little, like physically little. Um, Started professionally developing right at the beginning, I guess just before my 20s. And I came up in some organizations that, in retrospect, I can see were very high performing organizations. Like at the time, I had nothing to compare it to, right? And then kind of over the years, as I moved into more and more different contexts, I saw they didn't all work that way, right? They aren't all like they're not all elite. They can't be, because then the word elite would mean nothing, right? And as I got more involved with a broader range of software engineers, I realized that I should shift from trying to deliver really good code, or a lot of code early on, later really good code, to trying to help other software developers deliver a little bit better code. And that's kind of the trajectory my career took before I met Luniel. And then around the time I met Luniel, I started getting interested in not just the software engineering skills, although I still believe in those deeply. I practice them every day. And I preach them on an almost as frequent basis, but also the context in which developers work, right? I have become an ever increasingly strong believer in the notion that that's probably the overriding force, that the way you set up the environment for engineers has a lot more to do with whether or not those engineers realize the business goals. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do it with the best code. They're not necessarily going to like the engineering skills still govern a lot, right? But the primary governing force is the inputs and outputs to the team, and how you like wire that team to other teams and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. That's definitely a sort of core value that we have at Leanpub, that setting up developers in the right environment is sort of like key to everything else. I mean, a great developer in a bad environment will be a good developer. Would be a sort of cheesy way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
And
A good way of putting it, actually.
yeah. And so, so you've got this book. So what was the origin story of this book? Max, why don't you tell briefly where the inspiration for the book came from, and then we'll ask Luniel to go into some details about what it's about.
Okay. Because my origin story doesn't go as far back as it does. So we'll start with me, and then he'll pick up the baton and carry it further back into history.
Mhm.
So for me, it was really, I mean, the first step was Luniel persuading me, right? So I had a very typical, I think, perspective of someone who is an expert in engineering practices and in agile processes, and has been on high performing agile teams, which to be perfectly frank was resistant to these ideas, right? I was like, well, do we really need to solve that problem? Isn't that a solved problem? Doesn't just having the product owner in the room and being able to have conversations with the product owner in the room, have the conversations with the product owner, solve all of this problem, and just let coders code? And over time, Luniel kind of like got me to see that to an extent it was him, but then it also was our field work with teams that weren't as like kind of overperforming as the ones I was accustomed to in my early career. But he got me to see that like there's more to it than that. It's not about just get coding. And then, kind of long story short, I went through this whole journey of discovery, which I've got like a whole long blog entry coming up about, that led me from there to realizing that it's not even about optimizing the engineer's time or energy or what they're doing at all. Like, one of the limiting reagents that I've realized recently, one of the limiting reagents is actually the product management part of it, right? So you say, okay, we've got the product owner in the room and he can answer any question. Well, the assumption there is that he knows the answer, or that he can get the answer fast. But that's not how real organizations in the modern era work. One example is, we would have times where the organization had no one who could answer it. So it's like, it doesn't matter that the product owner was there and available and could answer the questions. In this case, they also weren't, but that's irrelevant, right? Like, even overnight, they couldn't go and answer the question because they couldn't find the person to answer the business side of that question. And the whole idea that you can have in a modern environment, that you can have one product owner who is paired with one team, but knows everything about the business that team will ever need to know, is borderline preposterous. And so that's kind of my journey of realization nutshelled for this video. And then I'll pass the baton off to Luniel to tell the real origin story, like from germ to the little flower where I started.
Well, honestly, without you coming from the engineering side that you do come from and your expertise in that, which is just, every time I see that and I see you working with teams, just blows my mind at what that is. But having you come at it from the engineering side and your understanding actually evolving to the point of where you see this value for me was confirmation. It was confirmation that I desperately needed beyond just the confirmation of me using it with teams and seeing it work, but actually understanding that, hey, here we have somebody who has the expertise and the history of working with elite high performing teams and still sees the value in that, right? And then helping that. So this would not have been possible, I think, in the way that we have it today without that side of it, that contribution. So thank you very much. And then going back, I mean, a lot of the stuff is, what the book is about, the Requirements Maturation Flow, it's got bits and pieces in there that essentially form a structure. It forms a process, if you will, a way of getting software or getting the whatever is needed in place for a team to be able to actually succeed. And there's so many different parts of that, but I think if I just try to summarize these things, as Max had said, as a product manager myself, and my experience in that is that I cannot just write out requirements for a team all day long and it just drops, in a 2-week period in a sprint, trying to prepare for the next sprint. It's almost impossible for me to write out enough requirements that are mature to the point of where the team can actually succeed with them for an entire 2-week period. It's just impossible in most cases, or at least it was for me. Maybe some other people can do that, but I know I struggled even with all my years of experience and writing stories in all the different or requirements in all the different types of formats that you can, right? Product requirement documents, business requirement documents, use cases, user stories, you name it. Gherkin, especially, actually made that even more. Gherkin from behavior-driven development made that even more prominent as an issue, right? You need time to be able to prepare and work through it, because I realized that if I just drop some hand-wavy, immature requirement to the team, they're going to struggle. And that was my experience right from the beginning with Scrum is, write a user story and then add some, as I want, so that this kind of very short form requirement. I realized that was just part of the equation that the developers needed. But, kind of been pushed to do that because that's what's being told in the industry. And so I tried my best at that. But I realized very quickly that sprint after sprint after sprint, or 2-week period after 2-week period, the team would really struggle in completing a requirement that came in such an immature way. So I started putting things in place. Like I would sit down, I would pull the team together, I'd pull my stakeholders together and other teams that might be the incoming request or a business stakeholder, and we'd sit in a big room, and we would spend a day or two actually talking about the problems, and the team trying to kind of whiteboard out what they think the right approach, the right solution, just in general in terms of functionality would be, and vetting that with the stakeholder. And we'll actually produce the requirements, the backlog, if you will, from such a setting. But it takes time. But that time is not recorded as product backlog items. They're nowhere to be found on the backlog. I'm taking up 2 days or so of the team's time. How do I account for that, right? And the push on Scrum's velocity, and I've got to keep on showing value, and every single iteration has to produce working software. And I just realized that there's these misunderstandings about what the process is. Anyway, and so
Is this, just sorry to jump in, is this explicit readiness work? Is this the stage
yes,
we're talking about? Okay.
yes,
I just love
it's a form of the explicit readiness work.
Okay.
Exactly right.
I had to jump in to see if I was in the right place in the requirements maturation flow definition and the 3 steps. And just to mention, I love that term, explicit readiness work.
Yes.
There's a lot of richness to that. But sorry, carry on.
No,
While we're, I want to clarify something real quick. So one thing is part of why you couldn't get that done is that there's an aging process. It's not like it's like cheese, right? It's like in a sense, right? You can't say, well, I need so much cheese in 2 weeks and I've got this many caves. right? So I'm going to use all the caves to make a small amount of cheese. That's not how it works, right? It takes an amount of time to do the like loop backs and whatnot. The other thing is, I wasn't there way back then, but I've seen it since. It's not creating work. Like people look at this and they go, "Well, we're creating work." No, 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 no. This is like test-driven development. We're not creating work. We're taking work that you were doing too late and invisibly and pulling it forward and making it transparent. Right? We're not adding work. We're just making it clear that there's work that's always been getting done. It's just we're not pretending we're not doing it anymore. That's the only difference. Sorry.
No, that's perfect, right?
Yeah.
And so as a result of doing that, I'm just going to keep running with that particular point, right? It's like when this work is hidden, and it's you end up doing it late because it's, your work runs over sprint boundaries, and then you have to redo it again, or it gets out into production and it's the wrong thing, or it's broken, etc. And you've got to go back and do it. Eventually, nature will force you to have to do that work, right? But what I realized in working, in the industry with so many different companies and different groups and teams of varying different natures, either companies that did software development as their primary competency, like Microsoft and places like that, or companies that do it as a secondary or even tertiary competency, like Nordstrom as a retailer building an e-commerce website and now actually having to do software development, right? There are still these misunderstandings by people who were not involved in the day-to-day actual building of the product, the actual coding, the engineering side of things. So from that, because that was so baked in and invisible, nobody really understood that that was something that needed to happen regardless, or at least there was a limited understanding of that, and in many cases clear just no understanding of that. The further away you're from the actual engineering side, the less visible that is, and the more likely it is that you won't have an understanding of what's actually required to do successful software development. But at the same time, when you then make that visible, it's like people being able to see inside the sausage making process, right? And when you can see what actually happens, when that becomes transparent, which is one of the pillars of Scrum in of itself, making that work transparent, now you can manage it. Now you can actually do something about that. Right? You can actually put it on a backlog. You can schedule time for it, and you can show how that maturation and that progression towards readiness is actually helping you achieve what you need to. Because if that product backlog item or that feature that you're trying to get out, it's just sitting there and it's not actually getting out, and it seems like teams are just churning and churning. It's like it looks like they're just spinning their wheels. Well, they're not really spinning their wheels. What they're doing is they're actually doing the work that needed to have been done up front and visibly. They keep on doing that, but nobody sees that, right? So it just creates this impression that, oh my goodness, yeah, these teams are just spinning their wheels. But now when we make that visible, and you say,
so long. Right. That's what they always say.
The analogy I was thinking of when I was going through your book, and I hope this is sort of close to right, is that one thing I have in my life: when I do something, I clear the deck. So if you're going to be like moving, you empty the truck, you clear a path. If you're going to be cooking, you clear the counter of everything on it first. If you're going to be doing some carpentry work, you clear your deck first. And if you don't do that, you think that tripping over things is a part of the job, and you don't, and then you move things out of the way when you trip over them. But making explicit, like, no, let's not trip anymore, and so let's move things out of the way before we trip on them. Sounds like you're adding work at the beginning. Oh, we've got a new phase. We've got to do a clear the deck thing. But it's like, no, you're going to be doing it anyway. But if you make it explicit that, like, we need to remove obstacles first rather than remove them later after we trip over them, then we can actually see the obstacles. Because if you don't do that practice, you don't see the things you're going to trip over as trip over things. The analogy I was thinking.
Beautiful analogy. That
yes.
is so perfect.
What's going on? You made me think of something that I think is valuable. I love cooking. And I love watching chefs, especially like Michelin star, or however you pronounce it, Michelin star chefs, show you how they work and all of that. And one of the things in cooking that all these professional chefs will teach you is to do something called mise en place, right?
Yes.
Is you get all of your ingredients ready. You chop your onions, you dice your onions, you slice this, you get that ready, get all of your ingredients ready so it's all nice and organized and laid out, and then you start your cooking. Because if you start your cooking and those things are not in place, then guess what happens? You have to stop your cooking process to go and grab an onion and quickly slice that or chop it, or go and get this ingredient and realize you don't have the ingredient. Now you have to compromise in some way or the other, or send somebody to quickly go and buy that from the store, and who knows what's going on, because this process is in play and you're not stopping this without ruining the dish, right?
Exactly. And that's a great analogy, because then once you've got a mise en place kind of setup, you
Thank you.
cook a dish, then you can realize, oh, I should have had them set out in a different order. I should have had a different size thing for the spices that I should have had for the onions. And then and then that fundamentally improves the process of cooking the dish. But unless you have the concept of like, oh, things can all be in place in advance, you can't, optimize the order in which you place them and things like that. So,
But a lot of people resist that because they think it's adding more work,
yes.
but it does not, right? In fact, if anything, it's making it so much easier for you to do, right?
So in your experience, how do you handle that? So for example, if you're talking to someone who's in a management position and they're like got some deadlines and someone looking over them, and you say, no, we've got to add, they had some expectation about what the order of work was going to be. And then you've got to convince them, you've got to add this new thing at the beginning. How do you do that besides write a book?
Well, there's two ways that I've done it in the past, maybe a few more, but just off the top of my head, I can think of. One is if they trust me enough, then I can say, okay, let me show you by doing it, and we'll make this work visible, and then you can see that this is something we had to do. But what I have found is the better kind of immediate convincing thing is if I can actually have engineers that I explain this to, if I can convince them, then they can turn around and actually help convince management, because when the engineers turn around and say, no, he's right, we have to do this work, and we had to do this work, and because we didn't do this work, we've had these problems and these issues, then it's basically the evidence from the field that shows that to management. So I try to get them to, trust me or believe, or try to explain it to them in some way, if I can, in a simple way. But sometimes it just takes actual people who've been doing this to recognize and say, no, hey, he's right. It's exactly what it is. And especially if they can connect that with failures that they've experienced over the past, right? At those leaders, see.
I take a slightly different tap. If I can connect with them as, like, if they're engineering managers, they're real engineering managers, right? They're not like some MBA that got put over a bunch of developers and has no idea. If I can connect with them on a technical level, then I try to bring in analogies, right? Like I use the test-driven development analogy, behavior-driven development. These are things that are relatively well established. It's easy to explain to someone who doesn't know them. And then it's easy to say, hey, look, you were going to test this code at some point, right? You know that. Or refactoring. That's an even better one, because maybe people don't necessarily really understand what refactoring is or how to apply it. But then you can have a conversation with them about that and kind of open their eyes to it and say, look, is it better to try to cram a feature in to a design that's not going to fit it? Or is it better to put the feature right where it belongs? They don't, well, put it right where it belongs, obviously. But, how do you do that? Because the design decays over time. It doesn't really decay over time. It's that the requirements drift away from it, and we need to change it. So then I'll have these, like, based on where they are, I'll get the idea of doing preparatory work in some kind of frame of reference they already understand, cooking, or whatever analogy makes sense, and then try to map that into this. And the only thing that doesn't always fit is if the source of the analogy doesn't have anything that's fundamentally inestimable, right? Doesn't have anything that is open-ended in it. So that's why refactoring is so beautiful, right? You're in this legacy code base. You're dealing with decades of abuse, right? You do not know how long it will take to get the code ready to rightly and naturally accept a feature. It's just reality. You could say, I'm going to do this in 2 weeks, but I mean, you could say, I'm going to blink 3 times and it's done, right? It doesn't really matter what you say. It doesn't make it reality. You don't know how long it's going to be, right? So once you get them to understand, refactoring takes as long as it takes. Fair enough. BDD scenario definition takes as long as it takes. Fair enough. You say, well, we need a way to manage and make visible those kinds of things. And if you can bring those two factors into their mind, then you can map it to other kinds of readiness work that they weren't thinking about, like chasing down dependencies or product owners or product people chasing down answers to questions when there's nobody in the organization to answer it or whatever. That makes sense.
That's a very interesting, and there's might be a very subtle point there, which is, so when the analogy has to have an element that's not estimable in it in order for it to work, but do you make the inestimability of it explicit if you're explaining? Because if people don't,
Yeah.
in addition to, we've got a new stage at the beginning of the project, we've got some work, people don't like to hear this can't be estimated about anything, right? Because they think that you just haven't worked hard enough or something like that.
Yeah, but I mean, you just have to. People are deluded into thinking that it comes from project management thinking, right? Like project management is based on these tasks which are estimable, and the reason they're estimable is usually because we've been doing them for hundreds or thousands of years, and they're the same thing, right? Like you need to put this many nails into these boards in this place in order to build a roof, right? Okay, so we can estimate that because we have millions of examples to form an estimate on. But there's nothing like that in software. We pretend it's like it because project managers go and they say, oh, test and code. They write tasks with the same names, and they pretend that they are then for the same tasks, like would make sense when building a bridge or a house or even maybe building cars, right? But they're not. The code for this story and the code for that story are just completely different things. And so, to an extent, I know it's uncomfortable. You just have to disabuse people of this idea that these things are estimable. The real problem was never the deadline anyway. The deadlines are there to create pressure to get people to deliver quickly, and the getting people to deliver quickly comes from people not delivering at all, right? In the past. So when we can unlock that and we can say, instead of falling behind, we're going to start making progress. But what we're going to give you is a velocity where the part that you're certain of is the direction component, and the speed component of the velocity you're going to stop even caring about because you at least know you're moving towards your goal. That's kind of, I'm starting to ramble, but
No, that makes a lot of sense. You reminded me of something, Jeff, we had a podcast a while ago, about this making progress and showing it and making it visible to people, what a fundamental driver that is. So Luniel, there's a couple more parts to the requirements maturation flow. There's the bespoke definitions of done and bespoke definitions of ready. And I just thought maybe let's jump to bespoke definitions of ready. What is that?
Well, it's the idea that every single work item, backlog item, if you will, that a team is going to take on, like Max actually just explained, tends to be unique. It tends to have its own unique set of requirements. It has its own unique set of tasks, even though they can be categorized often in the same way. But what is required for a work item to be ready is often unique. And that includes things. So the typical categories that we have in a bespoke definition of ready, the categories are around the requirements itself being complete, being mature enough, having a shared understanding by the stakeholders, product, as well as the engineering team, a shared understanding that's actually been validated as shared. And everything in place, all of the requirements being in place in order to get that work item done. So if you have things that are missing, like let's say you need a visual design and that's missing, well, how are you going to implement that visual design? You're going to hope that it gets delivered 2 days in? Well, now you have an potentially external dependency that you're hoping is going to realize in time for you to be able to complete that work item. But if it's not ready, how do you really know what it's going to take to implement that? What if it changes? And what if that change from the design, for instance, or an external a dependency that you have actually ends up being different from what you anticipated and estimated? Well, you're likely going to fail to be able to actually complete that in that dedicated time that you've committed it to be completed, right? So when you look at what makes a team successful to be able to complete a work item, is not just understanding the requirements and understanding, do we understand everything that needs to be done? It's what else do we need to have? Do we have everything in place? And so the definition of ready started forming as a concept because we understood that we needed to have requirements matured and get a shared understanding. We understood that we needed to have a definition of done, and we'll talk about the bespokeness of that as well. But you have to understand what done means for a work item, what all is included in that. And so you already have these two things that you must have in order for you to succeed with that work item. You must have clarity on and understanding of the actual request. You must understand what done means so that you can make sure that you can check all the boxes and actually complete all of them, right? And that just means that you now have to have that. But what else is there, right? So external dependencies, internal dependencies. I worked with so many teams who would depend on an external API team or another team, like I said, visual design or some particular artifact, architectural artifact, or maybe something from the database side or something like that they need, and they have to have that in order to be able to actually succeed with that. But then there's other things such as, when we try to plan capacity for a sprint, it's like, well, who's available this sprint? Who's out on vacation? Who's not? So you would start understanding, well, okay, does the team as a whole actually have the ability to complete this work even in the sprint, right? So you start getting into things like, do we have the necessary skills? Because if we're going to take that on, and even if we have capacity, do we have the skills? Maybe the team doesn't have particular skills with particular technologies. We actually have to go and get those skills. Well, that doesn't happen overnight. You can try, but a lot of times that doesn't happen overnight. So you have to actually maybe have somebody go for training, and maybe they have to try a few things before they can actually, or maybe you have to hire somebody with those skills, which all means that we need to understand all of the pieces that we need to have in place. We need to understand the recipe, if you will, and we need to have all of the ingredients in place so that we can actually start the cooking process to the point where we know that we can succeed with that. Because if not, this is one of those things that came to light as one of the reasons why teams keep on failing to complete their work in a sprint, why they would have sprint carryover over and over and over, because of all of these different things that impact them. And it turns out to be this readiness.
Yeah, that's a
Can I just share my favorite example?
Sure.
There was a team that, like, every sprint, at the end of every sprint, why isn't everything done? Why is this dragging on? And they were under enormous amounts of pressure before we got there, right? So we weren't creating the pressure. We were just trying to figure out what's going on so that we could get them out from under it. Oh, well, it's all done, but we need to test it. Well, why isn't it tested? We don't have test data. Every sprint, it takes days or even weeks to go and capture and cleanse the test data. So when we brought this into play, and all of a sudden there was a bespoke definition of ready for every work item, suddenly all of that test data collection had to happen in advance. And so they would just do it, test it, document the results of the test, and they were done. It just completely transformed their workflow as well as business's experience of requesting things from them.
And what process do you use for getting to a bespoke definition of done? Or is that the right way to ask that question?
No, that's right. I mean, we actually in the book we explain kind of how you get to that. We start off with having teams create a template, if you will, or one or more templates for definitions. You say, sorry, done or ready? Sorry,
Done.
Oh, okay, right. Well, it's the same. It's essentially the same thing.
More processes, yeah.
Yeah. Right. So you get the team together and say, okay, typically of all of your different work items, what are all of the different things that you've experienced that probably need to be candidates for considering to be done for a work item, right? And we'll go through everything. We'll go through, we have a starter list that we provide. And so we'll spend 2-3 hours on that with the team and their direct stakeholders, influencers. So it could be engineering management, product owner in the team, right? People that they have to work with on a frequent basis. And then we'll map it out. We'll just say, okay, this is the whole list as much as we understand that. And that's kind of your pick list, if you will. So you use this template so you don't forget things, because a lot of times people forget things, but it also gives you something that you can evolve over time. So if you find consistently that new things come up, or you consistently you've forgotten things, you can always add it to it. So it's never a static thing that's just there. It never changes. We teach you to continuously evolve that over time, inspect and adapt that, right? Based on your experience. But then what you do is you take that as the starter list for a work item. So you say, okay, here's the work item. We'll drop the template in as the starter list for it. And then the whole team gets together and say, okay, is this necessary for this work item? Is this necessary? And you remove things that are not necessary for it. But then you also discuss, is there something else that's necessary for this work item that we don't typically need? And that's often, it'll either come from engineering or from a stakeholder or product, etc. So there might be something is like, oh, for this thing, we actually have to go and, create some special documentation because, but it's not a typical thing, right? And so we'll add that as something that has to be done. And so you go through this process of essentially building that bespoke definition of done for that work item by having the team and the stakeholders in the room and saying, what does it really mean for us to say we're done with this? And then, we capture that in the work item as a checklist, right?
Okay.
And that checklist then gets managed during the process of implementation. The team is responsible, the engineering team is responsible for actually checking off each one of these items, checking on it as they work, because without that, they really don't have a true deep comprehension of the work required. So how can you even estimate that without that, right? So they need to be able to commit to say, we think that we can get this done, in this period of time. They need to understand that. And then they have to track that. It's not about managing people and dictating to them or anything like that. It's almost more like the thing that, I know, forget the author, but in Turn the Ship Around, he talks about how he got his teams to go through a process of certification. And when you actually have the teams, you get to a point of where they can certify through checklists, actually, to certify that they've done all the things needed in order to complete this particular task. It creates this feeling of accomplishment for them, but also that it's make sure that they understand and feel comfortable that they can really stand behind this declaration of, I've completed this task in the way that is expected, right? And then that in of itself, it not just creates clarity and repetition of the work to be done in that particular case, but it also creates trust. It creates trust from people on the outside. It says, when this team following this process is actually certified and they've checked this off, we don't need to go in the beginning. You're going to go in as product owner, you're going to check that off, and you're going to ask each individual one. But as the teams demonstrate that they are actually following that and they're doing it meticulously and in detail, right? Then you get to a point of like, wow, I can trust them. They've said it's done. We went through that. It just creates that type of trust, I think, that is needed, desperately needed in engineering.
Definitely. And there's a lot more we could discuss in the book, including anyone watching who's interested in learning how to transition to the Requirements Maturation Flow process. There's sections on that in the book, which are very sort of obviously battle-hardened, hard-won. So if you're interested in learning more, the book is ready, Why Most Software Projects Fail and How to Fix It. So thank you very much, Luniel and Max, for being on this Leanpub launch video today.
You're welcome. And thank you for facilitating this, Len.